Hey students, so remember the first 15 minutes of class, we spend that time completing our language MobyMax lesson. So if you have already done that, awesome, keep watching the video, but if you have not done 15 minutes of MobyMax, make sure you pause the video and sign in and complete that first. So the other day we started reading Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Sachar, and we heard some of the stories from the collection and learned that the stories are actually based on real people from our author's life. And then we discussed how that can be a way to come up with writing ideas. When you take experiences or people from your real life and exaggerate it in some way to make it funny or to make a story about it. But sometimes things are weird enough where you don't even need to exaggerate it at all, and that's fine too. So one thing good writers do is they study other writers to help them learn. By learning about other authors, you can see what techniques they're using and then try to incorporate it in your own writing. So today we're going to look at Louis Sachar's website, and we're going to look at some frequently asked questions of Louis Sachar and his responses to them. So the first question asks, what made you decide to become a writer? And he responds, I think from reading. My favorite authors became my heroes. I wanted to be like them. The next question asks, how do you get the ideas for all the silly things that go on at Wayside School? I sit at my desk and just try to think. It may be because the life of a writer is somewhat boring, sitting alone in a room, in front of a computer screen. It forces my mind to come up with crazy ideas. The next question asks, would you ever like to write a scary book? He says, I think it would be fun to write a scary book. I may write one someday. And then actually he did write one, and it's called Fuzzy Mud, and it's an awesome book. The question he gets is Mrs. Gorf, the teacher at Wayside School, a real person from your past? And he says, my third grade teacher. No, actually I wrote the first Mrs. Gorf story as an assignment in a creative writing class in high school, and my teacher didn't like it. In fact, she thought I hadn't taken the assignment seriously. But I always thought it was a very good story. When I worked at the elementary school in college, the kids liked it, and that's what made me think I might be a writer, or write longer stories. The next question that I want to direct your attention to is, what's the worst part about writing? He says, most days, it just feels like I'm not accomplishing much. I write for about 2 hours a day, and most of it just seems like a waste of time. It amazes me how after a year, all those wasted days somehow add up to something. Another thing I don't like is that it's a very solitary profession. I think it would be nice sometimes to go to an office and see people every day, instead of just sitting in my room. The question that I want to direct your attention to is when someone asks, do you go to schools to find characters for your stories? And he says, no, not now. When I was in college in 1976, I got college credit for helping out at a nearby elementary school. I got to know the kids in the class really well, and that's what led to the kids at Wayside School. But now I can no longer visit a school like that. When I go to schools now, I'm treated like a celebrity, and it's different. The next question asks, do you ever get writer's block? And he says, I get writer's block a lot. Usually I just try to get through it, to write anything, because I know I'm going to do 4 or 5 drafts of a book. So maybe the next time I get to this point, I'll have a better idea of what to do. So I just do anything just to get through it. The next question asks, what process do you go through in arriving at a final draft? And he says, I usually begin a novel with just a little idea, perhaps no more than a character trait. So remember, a character trait is something that describes a person in the book. So it might be that they're funny or shy or smart. That would be a character trait. That idea will lead to another until it snowballs into a full-blown story. Since I do not plan or outline beforehand, I normally don't know what's going to happen next. I go through several drafts. The first draft is very unorganized, often with ideas at the end that are inconsistent with those at the beginning. In the second draft, I organize it better because now I have a pretty firm grasp on who the characters are and what is going to happen to them. By the time I get to the last rewrite, which may be the 5th or 6th pass, I try to convince myself that the story is all true and that I'm simply telling it, not making it up. After numerous rough drafts, I send the final copy to the publisher, but that's still not the absolute final copy. I then work with an editor and maybe do some more rewrites. With each draft, the story changes and the ideas are transformed. I may initially have a real clear vision for different parts of a book. I know how I'm going to handle this problem. I know what I'm going to do here. And then I kind of get lost. What amazes me is that most days I feel useless. I don't seem to accomplish anything, just a few pages, most of which don't seem very good. Yet when I put all those wasted days together, I somehow end up with a book of which I'm pretty proud. Somehow I've now written 18 books. I'm always amazed when I finish a book and realize, hey, this is actually what I set out to do. So there are a lot more questions and responses. If you want to read all of them on your own, feel free. Just type in the URL, which is up here. So now is when, as a class, we would discuss what we learned and found out about our author, Louis Sachar. So some of the things that we could talk about would be how Mrs. Gorf was written when he was in high school, and that he actually thinks writing is hard. A professional author is saying that writing is hard because he gets writer's block. But one way he gets through it is by just writing, because he knows that it won't be his final draft and that he can always come back to it, maybe with a better idea. And then we could also talk about how we learned that he was a supervisor at the playground at an elementary school and college, and that is actually what helped him come up with a lot of the characters in his books from the kids that he met when he was doing that job. So now I'm going to read the next 2 chapters of Sideways Stories from Wayside School, and as I read, I want you to think, what characterizes a sideways story? Chapter 2. Mrs. Jules. Mrs. Jules had a terribly nice face. She stood at the bottom of Wayside School and looked up. She was supposed to teach the class on the 30th story. The children on the 30th story were scared. They had never told anybody what had happened to Mrs. Gorf. They hadn't had a teacher for 3 days. They were afraid of what their new teacher would be like. They had heard she'd been a terribly nice teacher. They had never had a nice teacher. They were terribly afraid of nice teachers. Mrs. Jules walked up the winding, creaking staircase to the 30th story. She was also afraid. She was afraid of the children. She had heard that they would be horribly cute children. She had never taught cute children. She was horribly afraid of cute children. She opened the door to the classroom. She was terribly nice. The children could tell just by looking at her. Mrs. Jules looked at the children. They were horribly cute. In fact, they were too cute to be children. I don't believe it, said Mrs. Jules. It's a room full of monkeys. The children looked at each other. They didn't see any monkeys. This is ridiculous, said Mrs. Jules. Just ridiculous. I walked all the way up 30 flights of stairs for nothing but a class of monkeys. What do they think I am? A teacher? Not a zookeeper. The children looked at her. They didn't know what to say. Todd scratched his head. Oh, I'm sorry, said Mrs. Jules. Please don't get me wrong. I've nothing against monkeys. It is just that I was expecting children. I like monkeys. I really do. Why, I'm sure we can play all kinds of monkey games. What are you talking about? Asked Todd. Mrs. Jules nearly fell off her chair. Well, what do you know? A talking monkey. Tomorrow I'll bring you a banana. My name is Todd, said Todd. The children were flabbergasted. They all raised their hands. I'm sorry, said Mrs. Jules, but I don't have enough bananas for all of you. I didn't expect this. Next week, I'll bring in a whole bushel. I don't want a banana, said Calvin. I'm not a monkey. Would you like a peanut? Asked Mrs. Jules. I think I might have a bag of peanuts in my purse. Wait a second. Yes, here it is. Thanks, said Calvin. Calvin liked peanuts. Allison stood up. I'm not a monkey, she said. I'm a girl. My name is Allison, and so is everybody else. Mrs. Jules was shocked. Do you mean to tell me that every monkey in here is named Allison? No, said Jenny. She means we're all children. My name is Jenny. No, said Mrs. Jules. You're much too cute to be children. Jason raised his hand. Yes, said Mrs. Jules. The chimpanzee in the red shirt? My name is Jason, said Jason, and I'm not a chimpanzee. You're too small to be a gorilla, said Mrs. Jules. I'm a boy, said Jason. You're not a monkey? Asked Mrs. Jules. No, said Jason. And the rest of the class, they're not monkeys either? Asked Mrs. Jules. No, said Allison. That is what we've been trying to tell you. Are you sure? Asked Mrs. Jules. We'd know if we were monkeys, wouldn't we? Asked Calvin. I don't know, said Mrs. Jules. Do monkeys know that they are monkeys? I don't know, said Allison. I'm not a monkey. No, I suppose you're not, said Mrs. Jules. Okay, in that case, we have a lot of work to do. Reading, writing, subtraction, addition, spelling. Everybody take out a piece of paper. We will have a test now. Jason tapped Todd on the shoulder. He said, "Do you want to know something? I liked it better when she thought we were monkeys." "I know," said Todd. "I guess now it means she won't bring me a banana." "There will be no talking in class," said Mrs. Jules. She wrote Todd's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Chapter 3. Joe. Joe had curly hair, but he didn't know how much hair he had. He couldn't count that high. In fact, he couldn't count at all. When all the other children went to recess, Mrs. Jules told Joe to wait inside. "Joe," she said, "how much hair do you have?" Joe shrugged his shoulders. "A lot," he answered. "But how much, Joe?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Enough to cover my head," Joe answered. "Joe, you're going to have to learn how to count," said Mrs. Jules. "But Mrs. Jules, I already know how to count," said Joe. "Let me go to recess." "First count to 10, said Mrs. Jules. Joe counted to 10. 6, 8, 12, 1, 5, 2, 7, 11, 3, 10. "No, Joe, that is wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "No, it isn't," said Joe. "I counted until I got to 10. "But you were wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "I'll prove it to you." She put 5 pencils on his desk. "How many pencils do we have here, Joe?" Joe counted the pencils. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. "There are 5 pencils, Mrs. Jules." "That's wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "How many pencils are there?" Joe asked. 5, said Mrs. Jules. "That's what I said," said Joe. "May I go to recess now?" "No," said Mrs. Jules. "You got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way. You were just lucky." She set 8 potatoes on his desk. "How many potatoes, Joe?" Joe counted the potatoes. 7, 5, 3, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. "There are 8 potatoes, Mrs. Jules." "No, there are 8, said Mrs. Jules. "But that's what I said," said Joe. "May I go to recess now?" "No, you got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way." She put 3 books on his desk. "Count the books, Joe." Joe counted the books. 1,000, a million, 3. 3, Mrs. Jules. "Correct," said Mrs. Jules. "May I go to recess now?" Joe asked. "No," said Mrs. Jules. "May I have a potato?" asked Joe. "No, listen to me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Mrs. Jules. "Now you say it." 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Joe. "Very good," said Mrs. Jules. She put 6 erasers on his desk. "Now count the erasers, Joe, just the way I showed you." Joe counted the erasers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. "There are 10, Mrs. Jules." "No," said Mrs. Jules. "Didn't I count right?" asked Joe. "Yes, you counted right, but you got the wrong answer," said Mrs. Jules. "This doesn't make any sense," said Joe. "When I count the wrong way, I get the right answer, and when I count the right way, I get the wrong answer." Mrs. Jules hit her head against the wall 5 times. "How many times did I hit my head against the wall?" she asked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. "You hit your head against the wall 10 times," said Joe. "No," said Mrs. Jules. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. "You hit your head 5 times," said Joe. Mrs. Jules shook her head no and said, "Yes, that is right." The bell rang, and all the other children came back from recess. The fresh air had made them very excited, and they were laughing and shouting. "Oh, darn," said Joe. "Now I missed recess." "Hey, Joe, where were you?" asked John. "You missed a great game of kickball." "I kicked a home run," said Todd. "What was wrong with you, Joe?" asked Joy. "Nothing," said Joe. "Mrs. Jules was just trying to teach me how to count." Joy laughed. "You mean you don't know how to count?" "Counting is easy," said Mauricia. Now, said Mrs. Jules. "What's easy for you may not be easy for Joe, and what's easy for Joe may not be easy for you." "Nothing's easy for Joe," said Mauricia. "He's stupid." "I can beat you up," said Joe. "Try it," said Mauricia. "That will be enough of that," said Mrs. Jules. She wrote Mauricia's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Joe put his head on his desk between the 8 potatoes and the 6 erasers. "Don't feel bad, Joe," said Mrs. Jules. "I just don't get it," said Joe. "I'll never learn how to count." "Sure you will, Joe," said Mrs. Jules. "One day it will just come to you. You'll wake up one morning and suddenly be able to count." Joe asked, "If all I have to do is wake up, what am I going to school for?" "School just speeds things up," said Mrs. Jules. "Without school it might take another 70 years before you wake up and are able to count." "By that time I may have no hair left on my head to count," said Joe. "Exactly," said Mrs. Jules. "That is why you go to school." When Joe woke up the next day he knew how to count. He had 55,006 hairs on his head. They were all curly. So those are our 2 chapters from our Read Aloud Sideways Stories from Wayside School today. So remember, I wanted you to think about what characterizes a sideways story, or what makes it a sideways story. What does each chapter have in common? So one thing you might have noticed is that each story or each chapter has weird things happen. Or the whole school is built funny, so everything that happens in the school is sideways. Or that each chapter has strange or funny characters in it. So as a class, we would discuss my next question, and it's, if you were going to write a sideways story about our school, what could you write? And then for our independent writing time today, you're going to write a sideways story about our school. So remember, sideways stories have funny or weird things that happen in them, and the characters are strange and silly. So to help you come up with ideas for your own writing, maybe you could write about a custodian who, instead of cleaning messes, actually makes messes. Or maybe you could write about a teacher whose name is Mrs. Nice, but she's actually really mean. Remember, at this point, I don't want you to worry about spelling or making your writing perfect, or even if your ideas make sense. I want you to get your creative juices flowing and write down whatever comes to mind. In your writing ideas section of your language arts notebook, you could also come up with a list of your own sideways stories for future use.